Hello and welcome to Chapter 1 lecture, Psychology's Roots, Big Ideas, and Critical Thinking Tools. Just for a chapter overview, we'll be talking about psychology's roots, 4 big ideas in psychology, why someone would want to do psychology, how psychologists ask and answer questions, psychology's research ethics, and using psychology to become a stronger person and a better student. This is covered in a video at the end. So these are 8 people that are pretty iconic in the field of psychology. You don't have to learn their names. You'll probably become familiar with their names just because we'll be referring to them, but you won't be tested necessarily on their names. More just about their concepts and the theory behind what's going on. For the scientific attitude, basically there's that modern science is possible due to 3 basic attitudes. Being curious, being skeptical, so not just accepting everything, and having humility. So, for instance, you can try to determine if people can actually read minds by using science. The first thing you need to be is curious. So research starts with a passion to explore and understand the world without misleading it or being misled. Questions to consider is, does the idea work? And when put to the test, can the idea's predictions be confirmed? So, is it testable? Is it something you can test? That was why behaviorists in the beginning didn't want to try to influence or study cognitive aspects of behavior because they weren't sure they could test it. The next attitude is skepticism. So, skeptical testing can reveal which claim, best matches the facts. There's a shifting reality from fantasy that requires a healthy skepticism. An attitude is not cynical, but not gullible either. With humility, researchers can make mistakes and must be willing to be surprised and follow new ideas if the data don't support what they were thinking in the first place, their theory. One's opinions do not always matter. The truth revealed in response to one's questioning matter. Early definitions of psychology. Psychology itself has sort of evolved over the years based on what we learned and our brought in information that we discover. So early pioneers kept it really simple, just the science of mental life, what thoughts we had and why we had them. Behaviorists focus specifically on behavior simply because they couldn't observe, like I said earlier, they couldn't observe anything other than just behavior. So because they didn't know about processes inside the brain and how to test them, they decided to just keep it simple. Freudian or psychodynamics parts of psychology emphasize the unconscious thought processes and emotional responses to childhood experiences. A lot of people think that Freud has to do with sex because a lot of his theory involves sex. But there is actually some interesting theory that came from Freudian psychodynamic theory. Humanistic psychologists stress people's human growth potential. Cognitive psychologists have the scientific exploration of how information is perceived, processed, and remembered. Cognitive neuroscientists, that involves the interdisciplinary study of brain activity linked with mental activity. This is kind of cool because they'll take an MRI or even a functional MRI and they will see which parts of the brain light up in response to thoughts or actions that are happening on behalf of the subject. So psychology. It involves the science of behavior and mental processes. That's where we are today. It's not just behavior, it's both. Behavior is any action that can be observed and recorded, anything a human or non-human animal does. Mental processes are internal states that are inferred from behavior. These include thoughts, beliefs, and feelings. So it's time to quiz yourself. Describe 3 parts of the scientific attitude. Answer. Scientific attitude combines curiosity about the world around us, skepticism about unproven claims and ideas, and humility about our own understanding. These 3 traits guide psychologists as they consider ideas and test them with scientific methods. Ideas that do not hold up will be discarded. So there are some famous people that have studied psychology. For instance, the study of psychology and its critical thinking strategies have helped prepare people for various occupations. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg majored in psychology and computer science while at Harvard. Psychology is also used in court. Forensic psychologists. They apply psychology's principles and methods in the criminal justice system. They may consult on witnesses or testify about a defendant's state of mind or future risk. So, time to quiz yourself again. The blank perspective in psychology focuses on how information is perceived, processed, and remembered. Cognitive. The blank perspective emphasizes how we learn observable responses. Behavioral. So to summarize 4 big ideas in psychology, the first big idea is that critical thinking is smart thinking. Next, behavior is a biopsychosocial event. I'll explain more what that means. Idea 3, we operate with a 2-track mind. And idea 4, psychology explores human strengths as well as challenges. So let's talk about the first one. Critical thinking is smart thinking. So critical thinking is thinking that does not blindly accept arguments and conclusions. So you evaluate the evidence in front of you and see whether it supports what people are claiming. You examine the assumptions that people are saying. You uncover hidden values, weigh the evidence, and then assess conclusions. Critical thinkers ask critical questions. Not critical as in mean, but just analytical. They think through the process and they have a thoughtful question to question what's going on. Big idea number 2, behavior is a biopsychosocial event. The biopsychosocial approach views human behavior from 3 levels: biological, psychological, and social cultural. Each level's viewpoint provides valuable insight into a behavior or mental process. Different people in different cultures vary in when and how often they smile, but a naturally happy smile means the same thing anywhere in the world. That has to do with biology. Also along the lines of biology is the nature-nurture issue. So nature is that our genes determine our behavior. These develop personality traits and abilities that are just our nature. And then nurture is the flip side, that our environment, our upbringing, and life experiences determine our behavior. We are nurtured to behave in certain ways. Psychologists explore the nature-nurture issue by asking many interesting and important questions. Examples: how are intelligence and personality differences influenced by heredity and the environment? Is our sexual orientation written in our genes or learned through our experiences? Can life experiences affect the activity of our genes? Should we treat depression as a disorder of the brain or a disorder of thought, or both? Identical twins have the same genes. This makes them ideal participants in studies designed to shed light on heredity and environmental influences on personality, intelligence, and other traits. Fraternal twins have different genes but often share the same environment. They also help to shed some light on the situation, because they were born at the same time and they have similar experiences. So we can say that it was their, not their heredity, but their nurturing that causes the differences. Of course, they still have some genes in common. So that's not an exact science there. Big idea number 3, dual processing. So this has to do with the fact that there are things that we're aware of, or conscious processes, and there are things that we're not always aware of, but that our brain is still doing, called unconscious processes. Much of everyone's everyday thinking, feeling, sensing, and acting operates outside of your awareness in the unconscious processes. Dual processing is the principle that the mind processes information at the same time on separate conscious and unconscious tracks. Big idea number 4 is that psychology explores human strengths and challenges. Early psychology focused on the understanding and treating of difficulties such as anxiety, stress, depression, insomnia, sadness, etc. Contemporary psychology continued the tradition and extended its research to include human flourishing. For instance, there's a field specifically called positive psychology, the study of human functioning. The goal is to discover and promote strengths and virtues that help individuals and communities thrive. Positive psychology, a little more about it, is that happiness results from a pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. It focuses on building a good life that engages one's skills and a meaningful life that points beyond the self. It uses scientific methods to explore positive emotions, character traits associated with positive things, and institutions that are helpful. These institutions include healthy families, supportive neighborhoods, effective schools, and socially responsible media. So why do psychology? There are limits on intuition and common sense and how far they take you to coming to the truth. Research shows that thinking, memory, and attitudes operate on conscious and unconscious levels. Most of an individual's mental life happens automatically, but intuition can lead him or her astray. There are flaws in intuitive thinking, such as the hindsight bias, being overly confident, and perceiving patterns in random events, which we'll talk about all 3 in a moment. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe, after learning the outcome, that the outcome could have been predicted all along. This is also known as the "I knew it all along" phenomenon. So, for instance, when drilling the Deepwater Horizon oil well in 2010, BP employees took some shortcuts and ignored some warning signs without intending to harm the environment or their company's reputation. However, after the resulting Gulf oil spill, with the benefit of hindsight, the foolishness of those judgments became obvious. For overconfidence, people tend to think they know more than they do. People in a study were asked to unscramble the following word puzzles or anagrams. About how many seconds do you think it would take you to unscramble each anagram? Knowing each answer makes us overconfident. You may assume the solution would only take 10 seconds or so, but in reality, the average problem solver spends 3 minutes when given a puzzle without the solution. Next, people perceive patterns to make sense of their world. Even in random, unrelated data, people find order. Random sequences often do not look random. In actual random sequences, patterns and streaks, such as repeating numbers, occur more often than people expect, although not as likely to happen as what we see in this cartoon. People trust their intuition more than they should, so intuitive thinking is flawed. Time to quiz yourself again. Why, after friends start dating, do we often feel that we knew they were meant to be together? The answer is that we often suffer from hindsight bias. After we learn the situation's outcome, that outcome seems familiar and therefore obvious. So how do psychologists ask and answer questions? They use the scientific method. They also describe situations, correlation, experimentation, and how would you know which research design to use if you're going to ask a question and try to figure it out. We also try to predict every. In the scientific method, you start with a simple theory. Here in this example, it's that sleep boosts memory. Then that leads to a hypothesis. Example, when sleep deprived, people remember less from the day before. That then leads to research observations. For example, you give study material to people before they A, get an ample night's sleep, or B, have a shortened night's sleep, and then test their memory. You get the information, you confirm, reject, or revise your hypothesis, and you continue to revise theory based on new ideas that you may have or new data that other researchers have as well. So let's talk about the scientific method. This helps avoid pitfalls of intuitive thinking by observing events, forming theories, and then refining the theories in light of new observations. So what is a theory? It's an explanation using principles that organize observations and predict behaviors or events. So basically, it's your idea. But because it's your idea, it can bias the way you observe things. Just because you really want something to happen, you may think it did. So a hypothesis is a testable prediction, often implied by a theory. This specifies those results that support the theory, highlights those results that could cast doubt on the theory, and an operational definition is a carefully worded statement with the exact procedures used in a research study. That way, someone else could do the same study and try to get the same results, which is replication, repeating the essence of a research study to see whether the basic finding can be reproduced. This is usually performed with different participants in different situations. Enables the confirmation of findings, that it wasn't just some random thing that happened, but it's a genuinely true construct that exists in the world. It enables you to correct and refine your knowledge. So what are some features of a good theory? First, it effectively organizes a range of self-reports and observations. It leads to clear predictions that can be used to check the theory or to create practical applications of it. It stimulates replications and more research that supports the theory, which then leads to revised theory that better organizes and predicts what is. So what are some ways to test hypotheses and refine theories? First is a descriptive method. Here you simply describe behaviors by using case studies, naturalistic observations, or surveys. Correlational methods associate different factors. And by the way, we're going to talk about the things on this slide in more detail, so don't worry if you're not sure what I'm talking about right away. And third, experimental methods. You manipulate or vary factors and discover if they changed anything. So, time to quiz yourself again. Why is replication important? When others are able to repeat or replicate studies and produce similar results, psychologists can have more confidence in the original findings. So, descriptive techniques. The first one is a case study. You examine one individual or a small group in depth. This provides very fruitful ideas because you're able to get lots of data points or lots of information about the particular individual or group. You don't uncover general truths because you're taking a long look or a deep look at just one or a small group of people. Sigmund Freud did a case study of a 5-year-old boy, Hans, who had an extreme fear of horses. This led Freud to his theory of childhood sexuality. Freud believed that Hans's intense fear of horses has its roots in the boy's unconscious desire to have his mother and the fear of being castrated by his rival father. I know, it sounds a little strange, but Freud was a little strange. Descriptive techniques. These are naturalistic observations, the technique of observing and recording behavior in a natural environment. These describe but don't explain a behavior. They can provide insight because you get information about what a person does. Here's an example of a naturalistic study involving Twitter messages and looking at their moods and how they vary by time and day. So on the x-axis, or going from right to left, we have time of day, so midnight, 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m., 11 p.m. And on the y-axis, or going up, we have the number of positive words that are involved in a post. Then each of the lines represent a different day of the week. As you can see, there's a general pattern regardless of the day of the week, in that there are a lot more positive words said around midnight, and then it takes a decline, and then it pops back up around 9, and then there's another decline that pops back up slowly for more positive words around 11 p.m. There might be an explanation for this in that people are sleeping during the time between midnight and 6 a.m. They're awake here around 6 a.m., but they are not excited to be awake. Maybe they're not morning people, who knows. And as you can notice, there are actually a lot more positive words on Saturday and Sunday than there are during the week, which means they're probably, like everyone else, going to work and school during the week and having the weekend off, so there are more fun things to say, more positive things to say about what's going on in your life. Another descriptive technique involves surveys. So this involves techniques for obtaining self-reported attitudes or behaviors of a group. You can examine many cases in Let's Step. You have to be careful though, because the way you word things can influence how people respond. Subtle changes in the wording of a question can have major effects on the way that people respond. You also want to make sure you have a random sample. A random sample is a sample that is fairly representative of a population because each member has an equal chance of being included. Time to quiz yourself again. We cannot assume that case studies always reveal general principles that apply to all of us. Why not? Answer is that case studies focus on one individual or group, so we can't know for sure whether the principles observed would apply to the larger population. Next question, what is an underrepresentative sample and how do researchers avoid it? An unrepresentative sample is a group that does not represent the population being studied. Random sampling helps researchers form a representative sample because each member of the population has an equal chance of being included. Correlation. This is a measure of the extent to which two events vary together. We measure how well one predicts the other. This involves a correlation coefficient, which is just a statistical tool to decide the strength of the relationship. This ranges from -1 to +1, and 0 indicates there's no relationship between the two variables you're talking about. So there's a positive correlation. This is anything that's above 0 all the way up to a +1. This indicates that there's a direct relationship, that two things increase together or decrease together. A negative correlation is below 0 all the way up to -1. This indicates an inverse relationship. So as one thing increases, the other decreases, or vice versa. A weak correlation is where the coefficient is near 0. This indicates little or no relationship. Time to quiz yourself again. So, indicate whether each of the following statements describes a positive correlation or a negative correlation. The more husbands viewed internet pornography, the worse their marital relationships. That's negative because as one thing increased, the other thing decreased. The less sexual contents teens saw on TV, the less likely they were to have sex. That's positive because here, as one went down, the other went down, but also as one went up, the other one went up. The next one, the longer children were breastfed, the greater their academic achievement. That one's positive. Again, as one goes up, the other one also went up. So just to talk about the issue with problems in cause-effect relationships with correlation, let's look at the example with self-esteem and depression. For example 1, low self-esteem could actually cause depression. In example 2, depression could actually be the cause of low self-esteem. Or 3, distressing events or some biological predisposition causes both of them. So that if you're high in low self-esteem, you'll also be high in depression. Correlation indicates that the possibility of a cause and effect relationship is there, but it doesn't prove causation because you're not sure which way the direction could go. Knowing that two events are associated does not reveal which event causes the other. So time to quiz yourself again. Length of marriage correlates with hair loss in men. Does this mean that marriage causes men to lose their hair? Or that balding men make better husbands? The answer in this case, as in many others, is that there's a third factor that can explain both. Golden anniversaries, or being married a long time, and baldness both accompany aging. So with an experiment, this specifically is a method in which researchers vary one or more factors to observe the effect on some behavior or mental process. Researchers aim to control other factors by random assignment of participants. This helps researchers focus on the possible effects of one or more factors by manipulating the factors of interest and holding everything else constant. That way they know what caused it. So random assignment is one way you can control the situation. Assigning participants to experimental and control groups by chance minimizes the pre-existing differences between groups If everyone has the same chance of being assigned to the experimental versus control group, then everything that could potentially explain the difference between the two groups has an equal chance of being in the two groups. So, the experimental group is the group exposed to the treatment, that is, the one version of the independent variable. The control group is the group that is not being exposed to the treatment. This serves as a comparison group with the experimental group for judging the effect of the treatment. A double-blind procedure is a procedure in which both the participants and the research staff who are collecting the data are ignorant about who has received the treatment or a placebo. A placebo is an inactive substance or an experimental condition that is given to those in a control group in the place of a treatment given to the experimental group. Placebo effect is that results can be caused by simply expectations alone. So if a person expects something to work, it does, whether or not there's really something to cause it to work. What measures do researchers use to prevent the placebo effect from confusing the results? Double-blind procedure, because neither participants or those collecting the data know who is receiving the placebo. So, variables in an experiment. There's something called the independent variable. That's the factor that you're manipulating or changing, the variable whose effect is being studied. Confounding variables, factors other than the factor being studied that might influence a study's results. And the dependent variable, that's the factor that you're measuring, the variable that may change when the independent variable is manipulated. So here, a researcher wants to study whether breast milk or formula leads to better intelligence at a certain age of 8 years old. So they randomly assign babies and mommies to be in an experimental or control group. Each person who agreed to be in the study has the same chance of being in either of the two groups. So they control for individual differences that might, or confounding variables that might explain why any differences found are there. So then they're assigned to the experimental versus control group, where the independent variable is breast milk or formula, and the dependent variable is intelligence score at age 8. So just to compare the different research methods, for descriptive, you observe and record behavior. You do case studies and naturalistic observations or surveys. You don't manipulate anything. And because you don't manipulate anything, you don't have control over variables, and single cases can be misleading. For correlational research, you use it to detect naturally occurring relationships to assess how well one variable predicts another. You collect data on 2 or more variables, but you don't manipulate anything. And because you're not manipulating anything, you don't know which came first, so you can't specify cause and effect. For experimental methods, you explore cause and effect. You change or manipulate one or more factors using random assignment. You manipulate the independent variables, and the weakness is that sometimes it's not possible or practical or ethical to manipulate what you're trying to see is the cause of something or not. So to quiz yourself, why, when testing a new drug to control blood pressure, would we learn more about its effectiveness from giving it to half the participants in a group of 1,000 than to all of the participants? The answer is we learn more about the drug's effectiveness when we can compare the results of those who took the drug, in this case the experimental group, with the results of those who did not take the drug, the control group. If we gave the drug to all 1,000 participants, we would have no way of knowing whether the drug is serving as a placebo, or is actually an effective medicine. It's important that we have ethics whenever we're doing research. When we're studying and protecting animals, we need to protect them. Same with protecting humans. We need to have values in psychology that guide our research. As far as animal research, has to be conducted by psychologists to understand how different species learn, think, and behave. We also learn about people from the things that we learn about animals. This has helped to develop treatments for human diseases. Examples are insulin for diabetes, vaccines for polio, rabies, and transplants to replace defective organs. Animal protection movements protest the use of animals in psychological, biological, and medical research. Use of animals for research is debated among psychologists. Is it right to place the well-being of humans above that of other animals? What safeguards should protect the well-being of animals? The British Psychological Society requires animals to be housed under reasonably natural living conditions, and social animals must be provided with companions. The American Psychological Association requires researchers to ensure the comfort, health, and humane treatment of animals and to minimize infection, illness, and pain. Psychologists have helped to enrich zoo animal environments, and thanks partly to research on the benefits of novelty control and stimulation, these gorillas have enjoyed an improved quality of life in the New York Bronx Zoo. So when studying and protecting humans in research, the American Psychological Association and the British Psychological Society have ethical codes to urge researchers to obtain the participants' informed consent to participate. So they'll let them know what's about to happen, what could happen, and what their benefits and risks involved are. We're required to protect participants from out of the ordinary harm or discomfort. A research study just simply won't be allowed if it involves too much harm or discomfort to participants. We're also required to keep information about individual participants confidential. So we'll use a number to identify participants and use that in talking about the results, or combine all data together so that we are talking about a group effect instead of just what's happening to an individual, so that people don't know, other people don't know what happened to that specific person when they were studied. And you fully debrief participants after the end. You basically, if there was anything that you couldn't tell them because it would influence the way they answered, you explain the whole study and you provide a benefit of why the study is going to be, why the study was done and how it could be useful for society. So to quiz yourself, what are 2 ways human research participants are protected? Answer: informed consent. Protect them from greater than unusual harm and discomfort, treat their personal information confidentially, and debrief them fully at the end of an experiment. Next, go to video number 2, which talks about how to use psychology to be a better student, which is actually by the book's first author, Dr. David Myers.